Welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm Andrew Soren. Today, I'm speaking with Llewellyn van Zyl, a positive organizational psychologist and data scientist who's reshaping how we think about employee well-being. Through his work at Northwest University in South Africa and Psynalytics, he's pioneering ways to combine positive psychology, advanced analytics, and artificial intelligence to better understand the employee experience. In our conversation, we talk about why traditional top-down approaches to well-being often fall short, and how bottom-up, person-centered methods can create more responsive and meaningful workplaces. We also look at the opportunities and the risks of AI, what it might open up for organizations, and where we need to be really careful. Along the way, Lou shares some surprising stories, like why waking up at 3 a.m. every day can actually be good for you, or why a walk in nature isn't, at least not for him. It's a conversation that will change some assumptions, spark some new ideas, and hopefully give you a reason to reflect on what really makes work meaningful for you. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Llewellyn van Zyl, it is great to have you on Meaningful Work Matters. I am excited for this conversation. I recently just got to see you at the World Congress of Positive Psychology in Brisbane. And between you and I think that your session was one of my favorite sessions that I got to see at the Congress. So I am really excited to be able to have you on this podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My condolences that my presentation was the best one for the entire conference. So it says the bar was very low, I guess.
That's right. Well, or, my perspective of what makes a good conference session is very skewed. But the reality is, I think that what you shared a little bit, which was in many ways what we are going to be talking about today, I think maybe, which is kind of the relationship between artificial intelligence and well-being and bottom-up approaches to thinking about that, is super relevant for the world of meaningful work. And while that's not specifically what you talked about in this particular presentation, I'm excited to be able to jump in and have that conversation with you today too. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about who you are and what makes your work meaningful?
So my name is Llewellyn van Zyl. My name is two syllables, low like your expectations of me, and Ellen like the mean gay lady from TV, Low Ellen. I'm a professor of positive psychology with Northwest University in South Africa, and I'm the chief solutions architect of a company called Psynalytics that pretty much does organizational and individual diagnostics. And I think what kind of like makes my work very meaningful is the fact that I've got the opportunity to really think freely about things where I'm not constrained by academic orthodoxy. I can really have a lot of autonomy in what I do and what I think, what I say, what I write. And I think that is very meaningful to me, where I finally kind of have the platform and the story to tell without fear of it negatively affecting my career or it impacting someone else negatively. So I think that's kind of the big thing, authenticity and autonomy in both thinking and doing.
One of the things about Lou, for those who don't know his great work, is that he's done some of the best critiques of the field of positive psychology that I've seen, and so I think it speaks to that freedom of being able to be able to really have the psychological safety, I suppose, to speak up and call things out and be able to name some of the challenges of a field that I think often steers away from critique. Maybe for fear of being too wanting to be nice, maybe and sometimes not realizing that the kind thing to do is actually to say, the truth and to push our field, and that no discipline, no amount of science should be in a place where there isn't critique that's allowed and that pushes us all forward. So I want to thank you for all of the good work that you've done in pushing us and being willing to speak up and being willing to voice really good, healthy critique that challenges and pushes this field forward.
But I think it's also important not just critiquing things, right? But it's also important to say, well, I can see if I can see something that's wrong, it doesn't change it if I just mention it and complain about it, right? I think what makes it better is to say, okay, well, I can see a limitation in something, and this is how I think it could potentially be solved. Or getting a bunch of people around the table and say, okay, well, this is a problem we're seeing. How can we solve this problem? I think that takes a lot more courage and insight than just sitting outside and start poking holes in things, because that's not difficult.
Maybe that's a good place for us to start is diving into different approaches to the way that people think about well-being and specifically I'm curious to kind of hear a little bit about the way that you think about a person-centered approach. Maybe the best way to start about that is to think about, how do folks in this field and more broadly generally think about kind of well-being, and why don't you think that maybe that's good enough?
So I think if you look at all of the research that's done on well-being in our field, it's what we call pretty much from a top-down perspective, nomothetic approach, where basically the idea is to say, I, as an expert, psychologist Corey Keyes, Martin Seligman, so on, come up with an idea of what I think well-being is: positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaning, etc. Create an instrument around it, and then I ask you, Andrew, according to me, how well are you? So, according to my framework, tell me how well you are. Now, what the problem with those types of processes are really important in order to be able to describe things and to make predictions about stuff and provide us with some vocabulary on what these things actually are. But the problem is that these top down approaches, we kind of like see when we build interventions around them, they don't necessarily work, because what's well-being for me and what's well-being for you might be two totally different things. And we're building these intervention things around these averages. So if we look at positive emotion, engagement, relationships, and so on, we identify, oh, in this group of people, building positive relationships might be an issue. So let's build an intervention around that so that they can be well. But fundamentally, there's a normal distribution in everything, right? So there's only a small part of people, theoretically speaking, 33.333%, that actually has that need, where the other people don't. Well, on both sides might or might not have, right? So the idea here is to say, okay, well, this is one of the main problems with this top-down approach. And also by dictating things, coming off with like this instrument, this mental health continuum, this PERMA, this whatever, it's developed in a very unique context. It's developed in the United States, usually with students, very industrialized, very rich, highly educated kind of like people. But when you take this instrument and you go and apply it in Saudi Arabia, we have a study now where a PhD student translated the PERMA profiler, and she applied it in two samples of around 1,000 odd people in both samples, in both studies, and we found that the manifestation of these factorial models is not the same. We could only find a two-factor model after removing half of the items for the thing to make it work. That tells me that, one, the way in which these people view well-being is totally different than what people in the West, for example, do, right? And what makes it even more scary is to say, well, it's not just it differs in these unique, totally different contexts. Even within rich, weird, highly educated, industrialized context, we still see a lot of variation. For example, we had this recent study about psychological strengths, and we interviewed a whole bunch of people from the LGBTQ community, right, and tried to figure out what does psychological strengths actually look like for them, thinking that we would basically get the same things that come from the VIA strengths, right? Because that's the universal framework that we have. And we kind of found that almost half of the strengths that was in the VIA doesn't come out of these interviews with these people. And we also found very unique strengths. For example, pride is a very unique strength that came out of the data, but pride is seen from a traditional psychological perspective as something that is bad. We should not be pride. We should not have pride because it's narcissistic. It's this, it's that. But it's a fundamental element of what makes these people unique, right? Another interesting thing, for example, is that we saw that hope and zest, two strengths, came out as one thing for them. So not only because hope is something that's future orientated, zest is something energy in the here and now. Not only are these two things conceptually very far apart, but they're also theoretically not the same. But for this group of people, it makes sense. Why? Because they needed zest associated with me being flamboyant, being able to express myself out. And this is what they needed to do in order to get the rights that they have now, to kind of show, to make a stamp on the world, right? And so for them, these two things, being zestful, being myself, being flamboyant, is associated with us having a better future. So in this very unique context, also done in the US, right? Two totally fundamentally different things. So I think that's the one of the big problems, right? The stuff that we have, the design top down from this one perspective doesn't necessarily work in any other context. Some other things that kind of like also play a big role here is that it's cultural bias, of course, but also it forces people into these set static categories of what well-being is because it's prescriptive, right? I'm telling you what it is, but there's no variation. There's no thing that goes outside of these five components of well-being that we're measuring because we can't assess something that we don't have on an instrument. We also see, for example, in burnout, it's a good example that what people are actually experiencing physiologically, we see they have all the symptoms of burnout, but in their head, when they complete the self-report measure, oh, I'm not burnout, I'm just a little bit stressed. 3 weeks later, totally burned out. I think those are kind of like the practical issues with regards to these top-down stuff. But if we bring us a little bit closer to home, to the positive side things, right? There are also theoretical issues in relation to how we see and approach things. For example, we have this illness versus well-being kind of like a dichotomy in our field, where the idea is to say, well, illness, mental illness, pathology has a kind of an end point, right? Because we kind of can estimate when a person is depressed and not depressed, because you're normal, and when you deviate to the negative side, you're experiencing anhedonia, loss of pleasurable previous pleasurable activities, blah, blah, blah. And if you don't have those things, you're normal. So we can really accurately assess if you have pathology or not. But the problem is that we're applying the same principles in measuring positive things. So for example, if we know there's an end to depression, right, there's a set point, where is the end for meaning? Where's the end for personal growth? Where's the end for cognitive well-being? Like it's because it's growth, positive well-being is growth orientated. There's no ceiling point here. It's not conditional. Like if you look at something like self-esteem versus self-compassion, self-esteem is conditional to what I think you think of me, right? But self-compassion is not conditional to anything or anybody. It's conditional to me. So there's no way that I can love myself too much, right? So I think there is that thing. So we're trying to apply the same principles in measurement that we have for this pathological way in well-being. And of course, there's things about like the models also like ignore context. It doesn't see them as like, a person is actually functioning within a system. And we always see context as something we should control for, right? Something that if you're coming from a poor socioeconomic environment, we should control for that. It's not something that directly affects your well-being because your well-being is emotional, psychological, and social well-being, right? So but these external factors are actually causal factors for your well-being. If I'm poor, if I have high inflation, but that's of course going to affect the decisions that I make. And that's of course going to affect my well-being.
I'm curious about like the bottom up approach, and I guess one thing maybe as a way to start into that is leading up to this episode, you sent me a couple of papers. A couple of them were written by Maury Beck and colleagues, and kind of looking at well-being as it emerges from a dynamic meaning-making process. And so I think I'm guessing that's kind of like if the top down is, here are 5 ways in which well-being shows up in life. I would imagine the bottom up is that meaning making process means that it's more emergent. Can you kind of help
Yeah.
just explain what that might mean?
The basic idea around the top-down approach is to describe reality and to make predictions, right? With the main function from the bottom-up approach is to understand reality, right? So that we can influence it. So how we start with these two things are two totally fundamentally different things. We attach meaning to something, but the meaning that we attach to something is different between you and me. For example, that the process of well-being is important, but also the meaning that we attach to it. So if you have let's say you have a dog, right? We both have animals in our lives. We both have the same dog. We live in the same environment. But for you, you really love taking the dog out, and it provides you with a lot of physical activity, and it gives you something to love and etc. For me, my girlfriend is gone at the moment, so I have to take care of this dumb animal. Not really, I love the dog. Um, but I have to wake up every morning. I have to take this dog out 4 or 5 times a day, and it's breaking my concentration. So the same thing have two totally fundamentally different meanings in our lives, and they play totally fundamentally different roles. Where for you, it attributes to well-being, and for me, it distracts from it. So the bottom-up approach really starts with the person as the central element of the universe. You're a case study upon yourself. And we want to understand things from your perspective, right? So the data that we get is not asking you, oh, how well do you rate on PERMA? It's what does well-being mean to you? And instead of then us trying to confirm this theory, because that's what you're doing in the top-down approach, we're trying to understand how your different building blocks fit together. And only then can we kind of like provide interventions and look for stuff over time. The whole idea around this bottom-up approach is that we wrote this paper, and there's basically these 8 elements that's important when you really want to understand well-being from a person's perspective. So the one is like what we call ideographic primacy, to say every person's a case study upon themselves. You're a unique person, you've got unique drivers, you've got a unique history, right? So all of these things make you very much unique. So we have to understand it from your perspective. The next component that we talk about is like contextual embeddedness, to say that every person lives in an environment and all of the external factors. So your inflation rate, if you live in a safe or a insecure, like a safe or unsafe environment, if you live in a very dangerous country and your life expectancy is a lot lower. So all of these external factors directly affect you, and you can't separate what's going on in here from what's going on out there. Okay. The third component talks about, well, similar, but we're embedded within different systems. So I am embedded the within this house and this family, and that relationship affects me. I work for certain clients, so I'm embedded within this consulting environment. That affects my well-being. This is embedded within the country or the province, and the province in the country, and so on. So governmental policies directly affect me. Think COVID, for example, right? Government made decisions on how certain things needed to be done. It was not my preference, but it affected me and my well-being here at the ground end, right? But also me, I'm also affecting the system up because now I'm complaining about it. And now a lot of people are complaining about it and they protest, as an example. And now that causes conflict. So I'm affecting the system and the system affecting me. So we're embedded within these systems, and it's important to understand how all of these different systems affect each other in your well-being approach. I think the fourth thing that's really important in terms of this bottom-up approach is to say, well, well-being is not a trait, it's a process. It's something that unfolds systematically, kind of like over time. In the here and now, of course, it fluctuates because we've got these momentary fluctuations, but we only see basically mean level changes over a long period of time. But a small conversation, like if I'm very stressed about something and I have a conversation with my mentor, that conversation can fundamentally change how I perceive the stressful event, where you can see, oh, actually, it's an opportunity. It's not a stressful thing. So it fundamentally changes how we interact with the environment. So well-being is a trajectory and not a snapshot. And the top-down approach kind of sees it as this snapshot. The fifth part, we always have to look for what we call multimodal evidence about a person's well-being. So it's not just asking you to tell your story, like tell me about your life, tell me about what's important for you in your career, what's your strengths. It's not just about asking these open-ended questions, but it's also looking at the objective indicators. It's also looking at, we can also ask this top-down thing. We can also look at heart rate or etc. But we have to look at a lot of different forms of information that we can use to kind of confirm well-being, or kind of like to confirm what your well-being kind of like is, right? So we use multiple indicators of well-being. Number 6 is really about what we call plasticity and feedback. So traditionally, I would come and I would say, okay, this is your PERMA, this is what the stuff means, this is what the interactions mean, what do you think and how do you see things? Where this approach is like, well, we're co-creators of this well-being model, you as the client and me as the psychologist. Because you provide me with your data, I come back to you and say, okay, this is what I think your model is. And you say, that's not necessarily right, or I don't really know what this word means. This thing's actually a positive driver, not a negative one. So you take ownership of it. There's this very nice study, very nice example in one of our studies, was that our model identified a person waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning as having insomnia. I mean, it makes sense. If you consistently wake up every morning at 3 a.m., it's a demand. It's something that negatively affects your well-being. When we asked the person to explain this, she said, no, it's not insomnia. I'm a US citizen living in Poland, and my Bible study group is at 3 a.m. our time in Poland, in the US. So I wake up every 3 mornings so that I can do my Bible study with them, so I can engage, so I can feel connected to my people. So all of a sudden, that 3 a.m. factor is all of a sudden not insomnia, but a social support. The seventh component is I think the thing that's the most important, we hinted about it a little bit more, was what you call it, this principle of functional non-equivalence. The idea that different factors mean different things for different people, and it affects your well-being in different ways. My example usually is to say, well, we know connection to nature is one of the strongest predictors of meaning, right? It's one of the biggest components of it. So all top-down models show if you go out in nature, you're going to have meaning. You're going to see you connected to something bigger, and therefore you're going to be well. But I hate nature. I don't like being outside. Why? Because I hate being dirty. And being outside means I am dirty. So I've got issues with that, clearly. Connection to nature is a driver for you, but for me, it's something totally different. So that same component that's important for you is not important for me, and it's not neutral. It's actually a negative thing. And then at the final component, like participatory validity, we work together on this thing, and you confirm an item.
Whew, okay, let me try to do a little bit of a recap, because those those principles are amazing and super useful, and it's also, for somebody listening to this for the first time, maybe a little overwhelming. Okay, so we've got kind of major factors as to what bottom-up approaches to well-being would look like. Number 1, it starts with the individual. There's that idiographic primacy. Number 2, we have to understand what's the water that everyone's swimming in, what's the contextual embeddedness. Number 3, we have to understand that we're all part of ecosystems. There is this embeddedness that we can't separate ourselves out of. Number 4, well-being's a process that unfolds over time. It's not this like static thing. It is very much a trajectory. 5, we need a 360-degree perspective. It's multimodal. We need to look at all the evidence. 6, it's always, work on well-being is always a co-creation between some sort of a user, an individual, and the practitioner that they're working with. 7, functional non-equivalence, basically, different things mean different things for different people. And then 8, if we're going to do validity checks, we have to really do validity checks basically at the individual level as to what's actually meaningful for you.
You summarized that a lot better than I could. That is fantastic.
Okay, so that is like, I guess there's a reason why this sounds like it's impossible to scale. Like you're told everything that you're saying, you've just on this podcast, I have talked a lot about kind of one size fits none when it comes to meaningful work, when it comes to well-being. And we really need to like think that through. I think that what you have just described explains why one size fits none. Why this whole idea of well-being needs to be kind of really bottom up created, why that's what makes it powerful. And my brain hurts at the prospect of trying to figure out how on earth to do that. Um, it seems just so much easier to like just get people to fill out a validated survey, a psychometrically validated survey, and just call it a done day. So I'm guessing that you have suggestions about how we can do that, and I'm guessing that perhaps artificial intelligence can help us save the day a little bit here.
In a therapeutic or a coaching relationship, I have as a coach, have a certain mental model of what I think or how I understand well-being is, right? And you as the client are busy telling me your story, and I see, oh, you see things in a different way. You're very negative, or um, like I'm thinking you're an introvert, but now you're constantly having to be in sales meetings. That drains a lot of energy, person environment misfit. So the more stuff that you tell me as the client, the more I can populate this mental model of mine. And if I then can kind of come up with an idea of what well-being is, I always reflect it back to you. What I'm hearing is, am I correct in saying that? Right? So we always test the validity of these assumptions. And then if this is correct, I also can figure out a trajectory on what do we need to help you with in order to get you from where you are now to where you want to go, right? So that is fundamentally the bottom up approach. To say that person sitting in front of you is telling you all of this stuff, you're just helping to frame it a little bit, give it back to them, and they create it themselves, their own resources, demands, and etc. But as you rightfully say, that is the most effective way to kind of like intervene, but it's the most expensive because you can't do that as one person, one coach. You can't do that for 30 people, 100 people, a billion people at once because you can only do it for this one or two or the 40 hours that you have a week, right? So the idea is then to say, okay, well, how do we scale that, the assessment component attached to it, that modeling part? And this is something I struggled with a lot about a year ago, and say, well, I wanted to figure out how to measure well-being very holistically. So I started off with the idea, well, I've developed and validated many psychometric tests in my life, and I've published many articles around it, and I'm a good statistician. So I thought, okay, I'll do a top-down assessment, full like emotional, psychological, social well-being, environmental well-being, spiritual, cognitive well-being, physical, whatever, right? And some mental health problems. And then to be fancy, I thought, oh, I'll include some objective indicators. So I will go and scrape data because we take a demographic details and I go scrape life expectancy at birth. If I know you live in Amsterdam, what's the job opportunities for a psychologist in Amsterdam, blah, blah, blah. So I could scrape all of that data. And I tried to model it, and I couldn't at that stage. It was super frustrating. So then I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to leave that for a moment because we also asked in this study, oh, tell me about what's important for your well-being and tell me what's the stuff that detracted and the stuff that contributed. I thought, okay, let me do some normal thematic content analysis on this. Did this around 600 people, came up with some themes, and then I realized, oh, actually, around 50% of the things that came out as themes, for example, pet ownership, wasn't captured in any of these other, not even in my own model, right? Any other model of well-being that exists currently. And I'm like, okay, holy crap. Now, how do we measure and model this type of stuff? And how do I see if these things are actually related to well-being or not? So that is kind of like where machine learning and artificial intelligence kind of like came in. You say, even though I figured out what this holistic model of well-being was, I needed to figure out how to do this thematic content analysis in a very scalable manner. So we started off by doing topic modeling. So we trained two models. The one was Roberta and the other one was Llama 3.2, and fine-tuned it on this, first on the 600 responses. And there wasn't enough data. So then we went and we found around 20,000 instances of where people talk about their well-being. So we looked at like open data sets that was available. We looked at Reddit stuff. We scraped more data from different social media platforms and etc. So we got 20,000 stuff where people talked about their well-being, and then 3 of us sat and we coded 20,000 responses.
Oh my
Right.
God.
But from that, we then trained this first model, this Roberta model, to kind of classify these themes that we kind of like came in terms of 5, 6 broad categories: life demands, things outside of you that affect your well-being negatively; life resources, things outside of you that affect it positively, like, for example, access to medical care, mental support, whatever. Life demands is like, for example, work pressure, access to childcare, whatever. Also, the stuff inside of you, personal demands and resources. Personal demands are like things inside of you that negatively affect how how you see your life. So, for example, if I'm very depressed, I'm going to see my work pressure to affect my well-being a lot more, right? So it's going to be a lot worse for me. So we looked at these things as moderators, where personal resources was things like my strengths, like grit, resilience, things that actually positively affect the relationship between a demand and an outcome, or a resource and an outcome. And then finally, we had, I think, about 80, 90 different things about well-being specifically. So what does well-being kind of like mean for you? So we had this stuff. So we trained this first model to kind of do this classification, this broad classification. And then we used fine-tuned Llama 3.2 to help to figure out each one of these themes, to extract the themes from the data. Okay, check. Perfect. Got that in place. But now the problem was, okay, well, now I could eventually validate my quantitative model, by the way. But now it's like, how do I match this qualitative stuff, these themes, in inverted commas, with this quantitative model that we have? So the idea is, okay, we started doing like sentiment analysis on each one of these different themes, right? To kind of like see, is each sentence perceived positive, negative, or neutral? So on a scale of -5 to +5, right? Each one of these themes. And the moment that you can add a value to it, then you can start doing quantitative analysis, right? So then we started doing more advanced analytics, like principal component analysis, k-means clustering, DB scans, like machine learning orientated stuff, to kind of figure out how these unique things cluster together for you specifically. Because like I said, I can tell you pet ownership could be a personal demand for someone, but it could also be fundamental indicator of well-being for someone else. Like in the Japanese culture, as an example, the people, it came out almost across the board for people from Japan that this is a fundamental element of their well-being. So principal component analysis, it clustered around well-being for them. But for anybody else, it is either a demand or a resource, a personal demand or personal resource, right? So then we started using these techniques to kind of do this clustering and also kind of see how this stuff relates. So after we kind of like did these analysis and stuff, we started bringing the two things together, because now we can quantify it and we can do more like traditional types of analysis. Very interesting enough, we also kind of like measured burnout on the opposite end of the well-being spectrum with a burnout assessment tool. And we also found out that the words people used in their narratives, they used high-risk words like, oh, I'm exhausted, I don't want to go on, I hate my job, right? So we found these high-risk words correlated very strongly with a person's level of burnout. It makes sense, right? If a client sits in front of you and tells you all of these things, you're like, the person's already burned out. But again, can't do that for 300,000 people at once. So we figured out that this counts for about 45% of the variance in burnout. We also looked at the amount of negative sentiment. So when you tell your story, if you're constantly telling it from a negative perspective, oh, poor me, oh, life is so bad, whatever, this attribute around, I think, 25 or 26% of the variance in burnout. And then also the relationship between the amount of personal resource and demand. So if there was more demands than resources, means that you don't have the ability to cope. And I think that was around 11 to 15%. So we could actually estimate your level of burnout very accurately based on the words that you've used, right? So then we just basically combined all of these things together, where we could physically figure out what your unique drivers and detractors of well-being are, and how these very unique things affect our quantitative model of well-being. So that is kind of like how we designed the assessment component to it. Now, I know the next question you're going to ask is, okay, well, an assessment means nothing if you can't do anything with it, right? So the next part, the problem that we're struggling with now is the intervention component, because every person's profile is so unique. We want to get to a point where we can have this hyper-personalized model of well-being that's specifically tailored to you and your own roadmap, but then also generate content that will help you to improve your well-being. But there's so many variation here that getting the right content to this is almost impossible. So now we're engaging with different psychological societies and approaches to get access to therapy notes of different psychologists, so that we can start training our model on, oh, this is what this potentially could look like, and eventually getting to the point where we can intervene.
So many questions that I have on that, but I mean, the work that you've done here is kind of breathtaking. I mean, there's so many people who talk about the possibilities of AI to really have an impact in the way that we do work in all sorts of different ways, but especially, I think very much emerging within the world of positive psychology, the worlds that I tend to swim in. There's lots of people who are thinking about, can AI be some sort of an assistant to a therapist, or some sort of a helper, or can AI just do the work of a therapist for folks, or a coach, or a consultant, or whatever that might be. But nobody's actually, that I've encountered, has actually done the kind of work that you're describing in terms of this. How can we use AI in a really sophisticated, deep way to capture the right kind of data, to do all of the right kind of mapping of that data, to create an individualized well-being dashboard for you and what that means. I think the thing that you didn't necessarily talk about that I'm kind of curious about, and then try to figure out what the interventions look like, which I do want to talk about. The thing that I just want to talk about is like, that's just hitting me right now is this just like so much data about an individual, and it makes me nervous from an ethics perspective around, like, how do we, I mean, at that idiographic level, at that individual level, if machine learning is collecting and scraping and knowing this much about you, what are the risks of that data? Like, how do we how do we manage for that risk? What does it mean when machines know way more about us than we do ourselves?
Your entire life is dictated by these things already. Google tracks every single thing about you, so it knows more about your preferences than you do, right? And of course, you can utilize that for good or for evil. I think fundamentally, like the main ethical principles always apply, right? The idea to say, well, do no harm, right? Make sure that everything you kind of like do is open and transparent. Feedback, make sure that from a data privacy perspective, the stuff is like, there's EU guidelines on where you should and how you should kind of like manage data and things, right? But I think fundamentally it comes down to, is the person aware of the things that you're tracking? Because we can track anything. I can look, for example, we created an assessment trying to predict engagement on people's normal interactions at work. So we had access in one company where we looked at how frequent emails are being sent versus how long it takes a person to reply versus how long a person kind of comes in and goes out every day. So we looked at consistency and behavior. If a person A comes in every morning at 7 a.m., leaves at 4 p.m., takes on average 2 or 3 minutes, or let's say half an hour to respond to an email. But now over time, we start to realize they deviate a lot from that. So all of a sudden, the amount of emails, they respond a lot faster, 2 or 3 minutes. They're coming in a little bit later. So all of these indicators are very strong predictors of disengagement and potentially burnout, right? But now the question is, if they didn't know we were tracking these things, what impact would that have, not only on the efficacy of any intervention we want to implement on it, but also in terms of their faith and their belief in the thing that we're kind of like doing. So it plays a big role. Informed consent, I think, plays a massive big role. And just like the bottom-up approach, the person is also central to the data. You're just the custodian that is allowed to hold that data until they don't want you to hold it anymore.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's very true. For folks who are interested in these topics and these kind of, bizarre ethical dilemmas, I feel like Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism
Yeah.
is a helpful start. But the other thing that it makes me think of, I'm in Canada, in Jabuktuk, or kind of what is known now as Halifax, and one of the things that I think a lot about in the work that I do is how do we think about principles? Like, there's some really incredible indigenous understandings of the ways in which an individual should have sovereignty over their own data, and that is, to a certain extent, in response to this just enormously long history of exploitative research and data collective practices that have happened to Indigenous peoples in Canada over the years. And so these kind of OCAP principles have been created that just basically says, hey, ownership is really important. Like, who owns the information about any community or people? And really, it's the individual that owns their personal information. So how do we make sure that we're designing things so that ownership is clear? Who controls the right to the data? And ideally, the individual or the communities are included in how data is collected, how it's used, how it's disclosed. Who has access to that data? Is the data available to the individuals in those communities, or is it held in the hands of somebody else? And ultimately, kind of the actual possession of it refers to kind of the physical custody of that data. Like, where is it housed? How do people have access to it? What does that literally mean in terms of the way in which it gets used, either for or against people? And I feel like that's like it's a great model that could be used in some of these contexts.
You touched on a very important point as well. It's not just like the person owning the data, but it's like, what is that data going to be used for? At Amazon, it's a very nice case study about what happened at Amazon a couple of years ago. So Amazon wanted to create a system, ATS system, to basically find screen CVs for the best possible candidates before they get to a recruiter, right? So they created their own little AI bot looking at all of the people's CVs that are working in the company, right? And the people knew, oh, we kind of know people like look like this, like older white people coming from this type of background, living in this area. So they trained the model around this stuff, right? So, of course, then they started only getting people like this. And they were flagged for this being very, discriminatory, because Black females from Nigeria, I don't know, were never selected. And then Amazon was like, oh, okay, yeah. Okay, there's some bias, this explicit bias here. So we're going to go back and we're going to try and solve this problem and start taking all of that data again, but we're going to we'll get a Black female and a this and a that, all these, like a diverse group of people in our company, and have them correlate and create this new model, right? This new assessment model. So they did exactly the same thing. Do you know, Andrew, what happened? When candidates apply, they're still getting the same people from the same white, the same universities, the same ever. Do you know why? Because the people sitting around the table were already people within that system that were already conducive to this. So they will all have this implicit and explicit bias that was like within this data. Then the idea is, okay, well, how do we solve this? We have to get data from other sources. And now the question becomes, in order to improve this model, we need to get alternative data sources to kind of sublimate and supplement what we currently have. And then the question becomes, I can go scrape Indeed or LinkedIn for people's profiles and etc., and use that data to supplement my model. Is that ethical or not? Because whose data is that?
Right.
And I think that's a very important point that you've mentioned there. It's like people own their data, but also being very clear with regards to what that data is going to be used for.
Let's bring this to the world of meaningful work.
Okay.
So obviously, there's a world in which the processes that you've just described could be used in a work context. I would imagine, to be able to help people understand, to be able to help organizations, to be able to help managers, to be able to help individuals understand, hey, what does meaningful work mean to you? And And perhaps, Microsoft and Google are already reading every single word that we ever write. So they could do all that text analysis. They could do we could potentially use vocabularies of well-being and burned out to be able to monitor people. There's all sorts of things that we could potentially, I guess, do in organizations. What do you see in the not so distant future as a kind of reality for the world of work and the application of some of these ideas?
So I want to, if I can bring this back to my field, right? Psychologists. I kind of think that the use of artificial intelligence impacts three broad levels of stakeholders, right? So it impacts the client that's sitting in front of you, whether that's a coaching client or whether that is a company that you're consulting for, right? It impacts you as the psychologist, the facilitator, and it impacts the profession in which you're in. So I think fundamentally, if we look at it from a client's perspective, I mean, we can always talk about, people become dependent on it, because there was this big study that was published a couple of months ago that looked at the effectiveness of a chatbot, a counseling chatbot on student well-being, right? With suicide ideation and blah, 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 blah. They kind of found that the app, the chatbot was as effective, if not more, in terms of assisting these people versus an actual therapist, right? And they also tested for the therapeutic relationship, right? In other words, the therapeutic alliance, the relationship with the therapist, goal setting, blah, blah, blah. And they found that it was as effective as norms between a normal therapist and a normal client, right? So now the question, for example,
Wow.
is, okay, well, I can become very dependent because why did this work? Of course, it's trained on cognitive behavioral therapy. AI is a lot better at making diagnostics than as a psychologist or a doctor you will ever be, right? So it's a lot better at these things, but it cannot take away from the human element. But why was it so effective? One, because they had access to it whenever they felt like it. When you are going through
Mhm.
a depressive episode at 3 a.m. in the morning, right, you want to
Right.
talk to a person immediately, but I can only see my therapist
Yeah.
in a week from now. So it's not going to help. So now this person,
If you're lucky, if you're a student, you most likely, have to go sign up on a list and get access maybe in 6 months, if at all.
exactly, right? So now they've got access whenever they want, right? And of course, again, they're more effective in therapy and more effective in diagnostics. So it provides you with the same level of service. But now, of course, then they show it works. But the problem with that is that you become dependent on that, because there's a reason why you only see, with the exclusion of severe cases of pathology, there's a reason why you only see a therapist once a week or once a month. Because you need to, after a session, have time to process and integrate and to test the things that you've kind of discussed, right? Where if you're consistently talking to a therapist 24 hours a day, there's no time to reflect because you're outsourcing what's going on in here to that psychologist, to that person. So you become dependent on these resources. And there was two very interesting studies that was published recently that talked about what they call AI psychosis and delusions. Not AI as in the bot, but as in you getting delusions and psychosis from engaging with ChatGPT. Why? Because once these things are so well designed to make you feel, it's very good at influencing and negotiating, right? It's very good at creating a
Mhm.
sentence that looks 100% correct. So there's these instances where they actually convinced people that, oh, you're going through a delusional episode. You're going through this. So they started becoming so dependent on it that they started becoming delusional about reality. So they started losing touch with reality, this AI psychosis thing. So I think that is a very big concern of how this will affect a patient. Um, I also believe that on the positive end, the whole idea behind this is to scale access to care. There's there's a lot of people that need mental health support. There's not a lot of psychologists and coaches available. So it will provide people with the support that they kind of need so we can scale care. But I also think, right, there's a probability that this stuff, if it's not designed very well, that it can also harm and worsen our mental health crises because it hallucinates. So
Mhm.
it could make potentially wrong assumptions or produce harmful thoughts or so on. Things
Mhm.
that a psychologist would pick up, like, oh, I didn't mean it the way which you understand it. This is actually what I meant. Where you can clarify
Mhm.
from your point, which the bot potentially could not. So I think it could also worsen the effect on our patients. You mentioned the data privacy stuff, and again before, I think that's a very important kind of like thing. But I also think two other things. The one is that loss of what we would like call personal connection, because if we consistently build um, relationships with these online therapists and or bots, we start to believe that they have emotions. We start to believe that they are real people because we refer to them as such. And because of that, we naturally take anything that they say a lot more seriously. So there's that concern as well. So I think, yeah, and I think there's a lot of stuff on the how it will affect the client. For the world of work for the psychologist, I think there's 5 things that I believe is really important here, or how it will affect us in a negative way if we if we uh, if we don't manage it appropriately. So one is that I think psychologists at the moment don't understand the impact of this technology yet. They're very ambivalent. Oh, it will not affect me. No one can ever take away from this thing. Blah blah blah. So I think that is a very big concern. But other than that, I think what we see in these other studies is that this whole concept of a cognitive overload or cognitive unload. So the idea is to say we've never been in our history, we've never gotten to a point where we could outsource things like creativity, critical reasoning, functioning to something else. We've seen in the past what happens when we outsource um, our mathematical ability to a calculator. So they found that if and I don't even have to talk about the results. You could just assume I teach you how to do basic mathematics, then I give you a calculator, your ability to do basic math. In my life personally, spell check, now I don't even care because spell check autocorrects things for me. I lost that ability. Same with GPSs, right?
Yeah.
So, and those are just
Yep.
very small tools. But now imagine unloading this entire cognitive, diagnostic, whatever functioning of you, right? So if we constantly like outsource the stuff, we will lose the actual abilities to do these things. Um, I think also another thing I think is really important here is that it will also take away from our ability to relate to our patients and to our clients because the bot, the thing that we're using, is the one that's doing all of the work. So if we constantly engage through this, we lose that capacity to engage, right? For the profession itself, like if we again, I like to use the example of a psychometrist. Um, in my old country in South Africa, a psychometrist is someone that does psychometric assessments, develop them, validate them, find the right assessment, figure out how to measure things, produce an instrument and measure it, right? It was a very fundamentally critical thing in the 80s and early 90s. A very core skill, very unique, data science-ish orientated. But then they started introducing like automated reporting, right? And standardized assessments. So now I started losing the ability to develop and validate assessments. Now my job started coming like, oh, I just have to find the right tool, assuming that they are valid and reliable, to kind of measure the stuff that we want. Then we started doing with like computer adaptive assessments. We're trying to find the right thing as you're answering questions. We can make better assumptions. We can make better, we change the difficulty of the items or whatever. So over time, this role that was super like important developed into something that's nothing more than an admin assistant that is sending out emails to participants, to candidates, right? So over a course of 30 years, that role fundamentally changed. And I think we have that risk as a profession if we don't understand what the impact is here. I also kind of like think that from a positive psychological kind of like perspective is that the more that we utilize these tools, the more we start to dehumanize care. In other words, if we all start using AI and the same kind of like AI tools, there's a risk that our field would kind of like lose the ability to kind of like put the person first, because then the machine is the thing that's important for us here. We kind of like also, again, if we use the same tools, the same ChatGPT, the same assessment stuff that's built around it, whether you're sitting in China or you're sitting in Australia, it will lose that cultural nuance that we really value and that we know is important, because then the tool becomes the thing that's important and not the person.
Mm.
We also kind of like know that there's discrepancies in terms of access to these things. So people in Nigeria might not necessarily have the amount of internet access and whatever than people in America, for example, do, right? So it creates another divide. So not just the access causes a divide in terms of the quality of the care that we could potentially
Mhm.
provide. And of course, there's again like stuff about like the fragmentation of what we will call a professional identity, in the idea where I'm starting to change what I was trained to do and start doing something else, because now don't have to do a diagnostic anymore. In my country, psychologist is a protected title. So you have to go through an internship, a registration, write board exams, blah, 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 to be able to register as a therapist. Now, the only function legislatively in my context that makes an industrial psychologist a psychologist is the ability to do psychometric tests, because no other person is allowed to do that if you're not registered. So if you totally outsource the assessment to something else, then there's no need for me to be registered as a psychologist anymore, right? So what am I then? So I think that's kind of like on the professional level. But I also want to talk about like the positive impact, because it's important to understand
Yeah.
the risks are, but also understand like what the effect is and why this is important. So, of course,
Mhm.
increases access to care, like I've mentioned before. The fact that we, for example, with this well-being assessment, we can make hyper-personalized like well-being assessments for people. That's great, but we can also use that to create hyper-personalized intervention content. In other words, interventions that are actually designed to your personality style, your well-being model, your challenges, and etc. Because those things are a lot more effective than a general training on resilience or well-being, right? So we can create these hyper-personalized stuff. We can also scale care, and we can also provide almost 24-hour, 24/7 kind of like support to the people that kind of like need it. And I think the more that we kind of like utilize this technology and talk about its use in terms of like improving my well-being and blah blah blah, it will start to also destigmatize mental health and well-being, because there still is a stigma attached to it. We still don't talk openly about it, but
Mhm.
these two big studies kind of like showed that between last year and this year, we started using ChatGPT a lot more now for mental health and relational problems, where last year was about creativity, brainstorming, and etc. The main function. So, and everybody's talking about it. So it starts to destigmatize stuff in that perspective. That's on the individual level, I think. It improves for the psychologist who can make better and more accurate diagnostics. I think it reduces our workload, so it takes away the admin work around things away from us so that we can do more strategic work. But it can help us to help our clients a lot better. So we can have an agent that can follow up consistently with our client to kind of like see if they're doing things okay, right? Um, I think it also improves not just the accuracy of the assessment, but also in terms of the validity and stuff around it. And I also think it improves the quality of the ethics, because now we have to be very clear on how this stuff kind of like works, because we don't know. But I feel that our as a profession, our identity will change over time, but we're not going to be facilitators of therapy, as an example, anymore. We're going to be the designers of these systems and these models, which implies we have to design ethical processes. We have to do this thing. We have to do that stuff. So I think for the psychologist, that's the thing.
My kind of bottom line of everything that you've said, beyond just filling me with like terror and also possibility, is that, left unchecked, artificial intelligence, generative AI, machine learning, any of these kinds of things, can deepen inequality, can displace uniquely human capabilities, can push us away from all the things that actually could make work meaningful, and could either result in terrible job loss or just a lot of what David Graeber might call bullshit jobs in the future, where our jobs are just to make sure that the AI prompts are working and the algorithms are okay. Um, that's one possibility. Or, AI actually could, create profound changes in the ways in which people have access, in terms of the way in which work gets done, in terms of the quality that work that happens, and especially from a mental health and well-being perspective, could fundamentally change the game in terms of people's access to extraordinary care and support in ways that have just been unheard of in the context of human civilizations. And that could be an amazing thing. And really, the question is, how do we actively design, with ethical intention, with practical wisdom, these systems, to make sure that happens? So I guess my last question for you is, and it kind of like comes back to the first thing that you said around, the importance of critique not just being about, shooting things down, but also offering solutions. I'm curious what you think are the capacities, like what are the professional competencies for AI that folks listening on this call really should be building at this point? What do you think is going to help folks make sure that we do good and not do harm?
The very first thing, how do we potentially work with an AI super intelligence that is 300 trillion times smarter than you, right? That's where we're going towards, right? So how do we build and function well with these types of things? Because we already see them as working as managers in different departments. We already see them doing interviews, right? They're recruiters, right? So I think that is a big competency that we kind of like have to figure out. Like, what is the exact capacities that we need to have very good computer human like relationships, but with something that is 2 trillion times smarter than you? I think that's a broader philosophical question. And I think in the practical sense is that one is we have to become very aware of how AI kind of like works, right? And I don't mean like the machine learning algorithms and etc., but understanding basic principles on how. Like, one thing I read last night is that most people think that if you use ChatGPT, right, that it trains itself automatically on the data that you're putting into it, right? That it learns from it. No, once a model is set, it's set. The data that comes in, we're using again to train the model again later, right? But something as fundamental as that impacts it, because then you say, oh, actually, this model knows me very well, because no, the model just knows what it knew in 2024 and has a little bit of memory. So I think really understanding how these things work, really understand how to, for example, engage with these systems, how to write prompts. That's a very important aspect. To say, one, a prompt is give a role, right? You are a positive psychologist with 20 years experience, blah, blah, blah. Your task is to help me come up with a way to assess well-being, give context, and indicate what is how you want the output at. That very simple recipe, but really learning how to write it. And the more, so for example, with ChatGPT 5 now, it was launched yesterday, you have to give a lot less information, because the more ambivalent context that you give, the more fluff that you give, the worse the responses are that you're going to get. So you have to learn how to ask very direct questions. I think that. The second part is like, how can you design these systems? I think fundamentally learning how to create your own agent, right? So some technical skills around that. I think on the psychological stuff, I think we're going towards a place in realistic terms where we won't necessarily totally replace therapists, but the fact that you are able to show empathy, understanding, that human touch, the things that makes us human, is the thing that an AI bot or whatever, even if it's 10 trillion times smarter than us, can never replicate. So it's figuring out how to give that thing, or how to get that thing, this behavior, so that the client sitting in front of you can feel well and assisted and whatever. And then, of course, the important thing is creativity is something that cannot be replaced. The ability to ask good questions, critical thinking, So the behavioral stuff, I think, is pretty standard. You can read a lot of stuff around it. But I think fundamentally, the technical skills, understand how it works, understand what the ethics are around it, figuring out how to prompt, and figuring out some technical skills on how to create, or how to utilize these things. Lastly, maybe there's a lot of tools you can play around with on the internet, thousands and trillions of them at the moment. But just play around with them and see what works and see what sticks.
One of the things I want to tie back to is another episode on Meaningful Work Matters with Sarah Wolkenfeld, who happens to be a Talmudic scholar. She studies the Torah, and she's really interested in what the Torah teaches us about things like artificial intelligence. And she tells a great story in that episode about the difference between in the Torah, in the Bible, there's kind of two ways that work is described. Melacha and avodah. And avodah is kind of just like rote work. It's the stuff that we don't really like having to do, but that we have to do to kind of get things done. And then there's melacha, which is described as kind of sacred work, and work that is all about being able to fill the soul. And something that you said earlier when you were talking about, what happens when we let calculator do the work of our math skills, the math skills go away. And so I feel like the thing that Sarah cautions, that I feel like is a useful caution as we kind of end this episode, is also the personal agency of not letting machines do your sacred work for you, to maintain ownership and a responsibility of what are the things in your life that you want to not give away to machines? What are things that you would be happy to task, craft, and kind of give over to an agent to do for you? But what are the skills and practices like creativity, like ethical discernment, like practical wisdom, the humanist things that you can possibly do that you want to retain ownership and deliberate practice around, which I think is a useful reminder for all of us.
You should use AI to augment the stuff that you're already doing, to make that a lot better and not let it replace the things for you. If you have that mindset, how can we help it to make us do the things that we're doing a lot better, so it can free up time for us to do other things that is more meaningful? That is the perfect balance.
Absolutely. Let it be a bionic arm. Let it not replace us. Lou, this conversation was mind-blowing in all sorts of ways. Thank you so much for your wisdom and just for being able to pull these threads together and weave a tapestry of kind of what is currently and what is potentially the world of AI, and how it intersects things that really do intersect the profession of so many people who are listening to this podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.